What does existential mean to you?
I think it's different for everyone.
More love and less hate.
Beyond existence.
I'm here, therefore I am.
To leave my mark.
Thinking about the world and why we exist.
Beyond reality.
Some people see the glass half empty and some people see the glass half full.
I'm not really big into philosophy.
I personally believe life has no meaning. Sort of one of those way out there, you can't really understand it. Man.
What does it mean? That's one of the greatest mysteries in life, isn't it?
Hey there, everyone. Welcome to Existential Coffee. We're recording today in downtown Chicago. It's a beautiful day today. It is also, I have to mention, Talk Like a Pirate Day today, my favorite holiday. We've been telling quite a few jokes with pirate voices. The topic for today's podcast is on the existence of evil. Does evil exist? We've got a couple of wonderful guests here, very thoughtful guests. Julia is usually here as the co-host, but today I have a guest host, Kevin Sprinkle, and he's a graduate student in clinical psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He's an advanced therapy extern here at Sankofa Psychological Services. Kevin is currently working on his dissertation, which is a phenomenological analysis of being angry at God. Thank you for co-hosting this with me today in Julia's absence. Our first guest today is Dr. Todd DeBose. Welcome, Todd.
Yeah, it's great to be here, too.
He is a licensed clinical psychologist in Chicago. Wrote his dissertation on the hermeneutical phenomenology of evil and grace, as well as lectured a year at Oxford University on soul pain and soul murder. He did a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy at Georgia State University, and he got his Master's of Divinity at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He has a PhD in Clinical Existential Phenomenology Psychology from Duquesne University. And you've presented work on the problem of evil, pain, and suffering called Abysmal Consolation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. It's an ongoing project that's both an attempt to pull together my interest in philosophy and qualitative research of experiences people have gone through that I call fated situations, a phrase I borrowed from Viktor Frankl, which is an experience of a situation that is not wanted, but something you can't get rid of, or it's incurable, or unfixable, or irreversible, and unmitigated, something that won't stop. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how people endure situations like that, their experiences of pain, and how something like existential pain or soul pain is distinguished from psychological pain or physical pain when one's going through those kinds of experiences.
So does the soul pain, are you conceptualizing it as it stems from the psychological pain, or does the psychological pain come from the soul pain?
The second one.
Okay.
I'm arguing that psychological pain isn't deep enough, and it's a derivative of soul pain.
I got it, okay.
And that soul pain is more pain having to do with the dismissal of meaning and lived meaning.
And then our second guest today is Joe Schlepsky. He's a Los Angeles-based writer, artist, and producer. He's the executive producer of Don't Tell My Mother and the creator of a self-published comic book, Mid-Grade Comics. You can reach Joe at the Joe Schlepsky on Twitter.
Schlepsky, Jay, with a just no H, no Schlep, just Schlepsky.
Oh, Schlepsky. Schlepsky. So Joe so it's Slepski.
You got it, buddy.
So
I should change it. I should change it now that I'm living in Hollywood.
Yes, yeah. So tell us a little bit about Don't Tell My Mother.
Oh, Don't Tell My Mother is a live show out here in LA where we get the best top Hollywood talents and have them tell stories that ideally would curl their mom's toes. So it's a storytelling show, and we also do a podcast of it, and we're looking to branch out into some other venues. We've been going for over 2 years, and it's a big production. We have a house band, food, drinks, the whole thing. It's a night out on the town. It's really been very successful.
Very, very cool. So the other thing is that you've always been a comic enthusiast. I can see actually you're Skyping in today from LA, and I can see in the background your Hulk comic book there.
You like that?
Yeah, it's sweet. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today is because I think there's an academic portion, but there's also the academic portion of the hero and the villain in comics, and I know that you basically have a PhD in comics, having been to your apartment before and seeing all the comic books you have. Do you have a favorite superhero or comic book?
It's probably some of the talking about titles. Starman's one of my favorites. Which is amazing because it explores the relationships. It's a superhero story, but it's really a father and son coming of age story, and not really disguised as anything else. Like it is about maturing and all that stuff, wrapped up in superheroics, and it's really amazing. But I think for me it always does go back to Superman. As lame as that and broad appeal as that sounds, he was the first and he's the best. So
now, if I remember correctly, wasn't there like what they would call like a bizarro Superman? So Superman's counterpart being
Correct.
like a villain or evil. Okay, so
he was like a chalk white, kind of a Frankenstein-looking Superman. Originally, he was from outer space, and in more recent years, they've played it as he's more of a failed clone of Superman, and he's not so much evil as he is childlike. And he speaks in the comics. It's fun because he speaks in negative. So, me love you means, I hate you. Me no hurt Lois means he's going to kill Lois. Things like that.
Okay. So, Todd, I think there's this like cultural and I think even contextual idea that evil is the opposite of good.
Yeah.
And I think throughout history, the idea or the notion of evil has been contextual within different cultures and different narratives. What do you see as, from your research experience?
Well, I think evil's been approached in a couple of different ways. One has been academically trying to intellectually define what it means, what is not evil, constructing a variety of answers to the problem of evil in theological circles, trying to understand what suffering is, why so much suffering, those kinds of questions. But then there's also more of an existential sort of approach to evil, of what it's like to live in it. And so I found every time I try to come up with a definition of evil, I find myself participating in the evil itself, trying to name it. And every time I try to define something as, well, this is evil or this is good, I find a variance or a relativity of something where the good also is evil is experienced by somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
The Taoists have a saying that the evil begins when the good man enters the room. And so I'm very suspicious about something being tagged as righteously good and something demeaned as hopelessly evil. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Kevin and I have been discussing this over the past couple of weeks, and it's interesting that you say that because I was seeing that you were saying that you become the evil thing that you were analyzing. How do you not go down the rabbit hole? How do you, when you get into that space, like what grounds you?
It's hard. I think it depends on how we're understanding it. Again, I think most people have in mind a particular act or a group of people or a person that we would consider evil. I think if we all shared, then we'd come up with the different kinds of ideas. But we're still looking at it from the outside over there. And what I found, though, that very idea of condemnation and the drive to retaliate or the drive to eliminate what we consider evil itself is part of the very thing that we're pointing at.
Yeah.
And so we find ourselves wrapped up into the phenomenon we're trying to get rid of. Even the idea of getting rid of it, which I think I'd like to see happen, is a part of the very thing that I'm trying to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you can ultimately avoid it. I think you have to be aware of it. I think the very idea that I can get clean from it, I'm suspicious of.
Yeah, so if God is good and the devil is evil, a rejection of either one of those would you consider either a rejection of either one of those evil?
Well, again, the classic way of theodicy, which is a theological word meaning how do you put together the presence of evil or suffering with God. If you're not a theist, then the way the problem runs is, how is so much suffering and pain occurring in a world that is supposed to be good and benevolent and righteous? And so how evil, I think, is again trying to bifurcate that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I thought if life and existence are suffering, like you said, then maybe God is evil, and that hating evil is then rejecting God.
It could be, but God is also, from many perspectives, seen as, like philosophy perspective, is seen as not a thing. And I think Jean-Luc Nancy, spelled N-A-N-C-Y, like Nancy, articulated it very well, but it's not the question of whether you resolve the problem of evil by getting rid of God as thing, if God is good. That's one resolution to it. The problem is God's not a thing. The question then is, what is God? Is that the presence of love? Is that the presence of reconciliation or healing or those kinds of things? But even there, who gets to determine what that is for anyone else? I think evil's not in and of itself God, the devil, which are personifications for me of certain human experiences. I think evil is, again, a kind of objectification and a devaluation and an elimination of what is personal and intimate.
I think we sometimes, when we get into the space where we are now, my first thought is to go to Nazis. So Nazis as evil. There's a wonderful documentary.
Jason, that's you and every other.
I'm not alone. I'm not alone in it.
Trope storyline and ever since 1945.
Well, so in the history of comics, who is closest to that type of villain?
Well, it's funny. In comics, both universes, both the main universe, Marvel, DC, Image has them too. They all have various versions of the devil. Marvel's main one is called Mephisto, and he's always taken different forms. But there's also Satanish. There's Doctor Strangefoe, Dormammu, and they're all devil-ish characters. And the writers just say that they rule a different corner of hell. And over in DC, there's Neron. There's Satanus. So they've played around with those ideas. And it's funny, you see certain writers tend to do more religious-based stuff. I'm thinking of J.M. DeMatteis, who's done a lot of real religious stuff recently, or over the course of his career. And they deal with that concept a lot. And they usually give the heroes a choice. And, you know, it's how it's that turning point in the hero's life of whether they choose the easy route, which is usually the evil route, etc.
So, Kevin, we were talking the other day while we were preparing for the podcast about how villains in comics aren't all evil.
Yeah, and it wouldn't make a good villain if they were. Like there's
Right.
very rarely a villain who's just like, yeah, I just want to be evil and just do harm in the world. Like there's always some kind of motivation behind it that like you can relate to, and that's what makes him a good villain. Like I'm thinking about like Lex Luthor, for example.
He
like,
had a
like
charity. He was charitable.
What's that?
Lex Luthor.
Well, no. His intentions for like his just complete hatred of Superman are for very like humanistic reasons.
Right.
Like it's for, you know, if we as a race come to just depend wholly on Superman as like a savior, then we don't really learn to, you know, take care of ourselves.
The rule of
and there's something to that.
every villain is the hero of their own story.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a documentary that I saw several weeks ago, and I'm not finding it here in my paperwork, but it was a wonderful documentary about the Nazis and, you know, the Nazis in Auschwitz, and then what they did when they went home at night. You know, and there's pictures of both. There's pictures of them standing in the concentration camps at Auschwitz and sending people to their deaths, and at the same time they're at home playing with their kids, and you see the joy on their faces and the confusion that brings up. It's almost, you know, it's not almost, it's ineffable to try and get to that space of how do you make sense of that. What do you think, Tom?
See, that's where it becomes problematic, trying to see evil as an adjective or a sort of a value, a descriptive value. And I want to speak relative to that, and also to the anti-hero in culture. Some of what Kevin was bringing up when we were talking about different villains in comic structures, that there's a mixed experience of that. The guards at Auschwitz, were caring and kind family members. The experience of what they were doing itself was reframed in such a way that Jews were not considered human beings.
Yeah.
And so it's not a care of human beings, or it wasn't a person-centered practice at Auschwitz, to put it very, very superficially.
Yeah.
The
genocide.
Again, and if we take a guard aside and said, you're evil, I don't think it's the guard that's evil. I don't think the act itself is even evil. I think there's an experience of evil that was present at Auschwitz that's beyond any particular person that's operating at that place. That's what's hard to get a hold of.
Because I was thinking, and I want to be careful and thoughtful not to invalidate what you just said, is that there's evil, there's a presence of that there. But I had wondered, were there serial killers or murderers or evil people who were in the concentration camps who were then sent to their deaths? That is the humanness part that I think you're talking about. If we're all human, that in that circumstance, it opens it up to have a completely different experience, but not omitting the idea of the whole circumstance as evil. No?
I guess for me, again, let me give you an example. Auschwitz, I think, is a huge example, and it's the one most people go to.
Yeah.
I was thinking about when I felt in the presence of evil, what was going on and what kind of circumstances were happening, and then I kept trying to figure out, why is that evil? And I remember not only just sometimes doing therapy or counseling with folks who would come in, and I remember a person that came in one who talked about choking the life out of animals until their eyes went black. But there's something about, it wasn't this person that was evil. It was something in the room. There was an experience of something that settled in. It's similar to another example that I had when I was watching a cultural video about how cuisine works. And they had taken a monkey and trapped the monkey in a container. And the guest, it was a very specially invited situation where the guests were given mallets, and they clubbed the monkey to death.
It's alive.
Right, it's alive. They clubbed the monkey to death. And the monkey couldn't get loose. The monkey just screamed until it was beaten to death. And something settled in on me that was something that I would consider not the people there evil, but something felt evil about that. And as a phenomenologist, I'm interested in that experience, whether it's at Auschwitz, whether it's at that dinner table, whether it's in therapy, whether it's in our own lives.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the way you guys were talking about comics and the villain and the hero, that even the villain can't be all evil, or there isn't that humanness about them. It's not as, I guess, as interesting. That that there has to be something whole.
I think for years, for a long time in comic books specifically, your villains were very paper thin. They were just, I'm a bank robber and come get me. And as comic storytelling evolved, people got bored. I think it's when people who grew up reading comic books started becoming the people creating comic books. It's when they searched out for more depth in their stories.
The other thing I was thinking of is there was a clip from one of my favorite shows, The Walking Dead, and from last season, and there was one part. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to say all the characters' names, but there was one part where there was one of the characters was a new character that they had met along the way along this road that they were on, and some zombies came and they started fighting the zombies, and the new guy looked like he was really enjoying it. And afterwards, one of the main characters said, you looked like you were really enjoying it, and he's like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. That I get to kill people all day long. And that was really interesting to me, that the change of the context just so dramatically changed the stigma around what it is to be evil. Yeah.
Then I think it's also like in that, like, part of the context change is also that they're not really people anymore. and I wonder if that kind of goes back to what we were saying about genocide, that maybe that kind of
Right.
opens that up as a possibility when they're not people, you know.
It certainly relates to objectification
Mhm.
and taking the personal out.
Yeah.
And I think that's what whether it's the personal out or innocence out or those kinds of experiences. But I think there is a difference between something being immoral and something evil. I do think the quality of the experience may be different with The Walking Dead, but also like one of the things that is interesting, one of my students is doing research on adolescents' interest in more adult series like Breaking Bad, like House of Cards, Walking Dead, and what their attraction is. And a lot of it has to do with the anti-hero experience, that who's evil in that?
Yeah.
And for what reason?
Yeah.
And what's moral and what's immoral? There's a relativity about that draws one in to figure things out. But there are moments in those experiences where I think most folks kind of recoil. But what are they recoiling from?
Yeah, and that's fascinating now that we're talking about this more. That's the draw to these shows, I imagine, that day to day there could be people out there, what we might refer to as sociopaths in our culture, out there living what we would say normal lives, and to watch that and to be attracted to that, I think speaks to what you're saying, is that it's the experience, not necessarily that person.
Well, right. I mean, it's easy to tag evil people as sociopathic, and we'll be done with the conversation. But let's take a look at what R.D. Laing would say about the pathology of normality. So the ones pointing the fingers at the sociopaths, we would consider those who are normal and middle of the road. But that kind of banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, doesn't that have a kind of dehumanizing, objectifying, reductionistic kind of way of treating other human beings as well, and being detached from it? Again, I don't know if it's helpful to point the finger at just people. I think people are caught in something. Now, the interesting question is, that something we create, or is it something that has a force of its own? Is it a part of life, or is it something that's constructed that can be deconstructed?
Yeah, because I think if we lived on planet Lex Luthor, maybe Superman would be, would be the evil one.
And actually, there's a really interesting comic called Superman Red Sun, where what happens is it's like hypothetically what would happen if Superman landed in the Soviet Union in the 1950s instead of America, and just how the whole world changes and then what gets constructed as evil as a result of that. It's really interesting.
Joe, you were going to say something?
Yeah, actually, Red Sun's a great example, but in the Silver Age, Lex Luthor did have a planet, and he was the hero on that planet. It eventually gets destroyed, and I think this in a comic that came out around like '83 or whatever, and that's how they brought the character back to Earth for a little bit. But he did get the chance to play out the hero role, and Superman was the bad guy whenever Superman would visit the planet.
So from a Judeo-Christian morality, the existence of evil is necessary. The cultural, contextual perspective of it, what's been constructed.
Don't you think it's a matter of contrast? Without one, you can't truly define the other?
I think if you have to, again, the whole idea of good and evil extends from before a Judeo-Christian kind of demarcation. I do think it's more Zoroastrian and Manichaean Gnosticism, where evil is defined as that which is material, and that which is spiritual and immaterial is good. And it's that very split, I think, that perpetuates the evil itself. Now, I guess the question could be, is unmitigated, undeserved suffering, is the death of innocence something that could be prevented, or is it something inherent in life? And every attempt I've seen to try to get rid of it doesn't seem to be successful. So the question then is, do we not do anything about that? And I think we certainly have to, but to what ends? Sometimes I think in the midst, I remember somebody was asking Fred Rogers about what do you do with children when they see such horror like that? And he said, point to the people who are caring in the midst of it. In some ways, I don't know if the project is elimination. If it's a purification project, I think it perpetuates evil. If it's in spite of it, there's a way to love. and care, maybe that's the response.
Mm-hmm.
But there again, I found love also something that can be very abusive, according to who defines what it is. But even if I look at the Hulk sort of poster behind you, again, the Hulk was a favorite of mine, and often we'll tag unbridled aggression and violence as evil. But when the Hulk would show up, I'd calm down as a kid. I knew everything was going to be fine now because the Hulk would take care of it. And so he wasn't seen as evil.
Yeah, I love the line he used to always say is, "I'm getting angry, and you won't like me when I'm angry." You know? Yeah, it was a great line.
Well, one question that's coming up for me now is like, how much of, like, when you experience somebody or some situation as evil, how much of it is like just otherness? I mean, to me, it feels like it's more than just otherness. Like, it's more than just, you know, I wouldn't be the way the Hulk is. Like, that's not something I would choose for myself. It seems like when we say something evil, there's something more to it than just that.
Like we're all capable of being evil.
Yeah, but like I might not call the Hulk evil, but I would call him other. You know?
I see.
Like, and I'm thinking about like what that difference is now. I'm not really sure though.
Well, I guess, you know, what I'm thinking about, Kevin, when you're talking about that is then would evil be the opposite of that otherness in somehow or another, and what would it look like? If it weren't hulkish, then it must not be evil, but what would that look like?
So let's switch gears just a little bit, and because I know you have a little bit of experience with this, if I
I want
remember.
to talk Hulk more.
Oh yeah, go ahead. No, please do. Do you want to talk? Yeah.
Yeah, no. Well, it's funny talking about Hulk. I think that's a fascinating subject for a psychology podcast, because the Hulk has long been portrayed, and I'm talking about the traditional Hulk smash. There's been different he actually a little bit of multiple personality, where he's had different iterations. But this traditional one, I think that we're talking about, the green, big, angry behemoth, that has since right around like 1980, 1981, that's been portrayed as the childlike manifestation from being abused, as Bruce Banner was abused as a boy by his father, verbally, not sexually abused, but physically, verbally, and then he watched his father beat on his mother. And that's the Hulk, is that inner rage of the impotent child come to life via the gamma rays, as gamma rays are wont to do.
So what about Stockholm Syndrome or cults? How in popular media we see that there's the evil, like let's say hostage taker, and that sometimes it's perceived as, so you look at Jonestown or some other type of cult where there's one leader and then everyone responds to that person, even though they're evil, you know, supports them.
You know, again, with a Stockholm Syndrome or a situation like, you know, mass suicide, once again, I think that the person who aligns with the very thing that's destructive, I would argue that it's not a pathological kind of thing. I think what happens is they do see something that matches a particular kind of need in them, and they see something that's also humane in the situation. They move beyond this bifurcation of evil and good. It's easy to sort of talk about somebody being brainwashed to only see a certain kind of piece of it, but it won't stick unless there's something that is touching something inside around that kind of thing. So I don't, again, would see that per se this itself would be evil. What's talking about the Hulk experience in this is how much agency is involved in the choices that one's doing. And does that point have something to do with what we define as evil or not? If one is caused to do something through gamma radiation, neuropsychology, a history of abuse, political, social, revolution, can we consider that evil or not in and of itself?
Yeah, it occurs to me that, I mean, as existentialists and phenomenologists, we look at psychopathology, I'm using air quotes, as an issue of mortality. But I think a derivative of it is aggression, anger, rage at mortality possibly. But if there's a stigma around aggression, if there's a stigma that aggression or anger or rage against the dying of the light, so to speak, is there, then there's a fear I will be evil if I express myself in a way that is human, or I will be evil and if I express myself at all. I don't know if that's making sense, but
It does make sense, but then the question is, according to who?
Mm.
And who gets to define that?
Mhm.
And again, I agree that often aggression is an attempt to get somebody other than where they are. It's to make somebody different than you want them to be. It can be a fight against our limits, and the destructive things can come out of that. But it makes me think originally of the early Greek word hamartia, which has been, I think, mistranslated grossly as sin. But what it begins in Homer's experience of the hero intending one thing only to be very, very destructive in the outcomes.
Yeah.
And so again, the intentionality is not destruction itself. And when I was doing my early work on this, and what I wrote my dissertation on was the experience of evil as a type of working out a type of mourning. There's a stance that's taken of protest, of destroying whatever it is that leaves me alone in a place where somebody's not suffering but I am. And so part of the expression of evil is to narrow the playing field. So it feels as if there's no agenda operating at all, but I do think there's very much a project to level life out, particularly if I'm lifeless.
Yeah, and I guess that's what makes comics so interesting is the experience of it. That when I imagine, for Kevin and Joe, that the experience of reading a comic is probably very congruent with whatever the experiences you're talking about around evil, which may make it interesting. It occurred to me while we've been talking that I work with a lot of clients who have been through trauma, and that if you're in an experience that is evil and for whatever reason traumatized, or I know this will close down, but victimized, oftentimes there's an eyes open that emerges from that, where someone can just walk into a party or walk into a room with a group full of people and just know the person who's quote unquote evil. But now I'm understanding that the person that maybe that they're identifying isn't necessarily evil, but maybe a conduit for whatever the experience is.
I think so. And again, I would be interested what particular they're picking up when they walk into the room, that they are hesitant. Maybe it's an intuitive thing, or a certain way somebody's looking or relating to them. But again, I think people get caught up in evil as a structure.
Right.
And I think therapists, well-meaning therapists, in my opinion, can very easily get caught up in the name of good, controlling, objectifying, reducing the humaneness of a person with socially reaffirmed and accepted kinds of ways of talking about clients, treating them, and so forth.
So how would you approach this? I mean, not only as a clinician, but human out in the world, how, from a cultural perspective, because I don't think it's an intention to invalidate, but that someone might feel invalidated by the fact that there aren't bad people in the world.
I think people will be upset if we say there aren't bad people in the world, because I think people have suffered at the hands of people that they would say are bad.
Right.
But I think, once again, if we start tagging this group is bad and this group is good, or I'm good and you're bad, we feed right into that. I think the way to handle that, that's why I'm interested in soul murder. And I think soul for me is lived meaning. And that's very different in different cultures with different individuals. I think it's singular. I think every single person has a different way of living out what it means to be a human being. They communicate that in their stories, in their words, their behaviors, how they express themselves. And I think the way to handle some of this is, again, attending to that. I think anytime we end up killing that, reducing it, ignoring it, explaining it away, in any kind of way like that, we're engaged in a kind of soul murder, because we're trying to kill what matters. Anytime we try to hegemonically try to impose what we think has to be the case on somebody else, I think we're engaging in that.
like evil is a tumor that needs to be removed and
Yes,
sort of tossed aside.
but once again, if I say, well, I'm not evil because I don't do that, I'm already rejecting somebody that does that. So that's how quickly we can get in it.
Okay.
Guys, I have to interrupt. Jason, you just said evil is a tumor and it needs to be removed. That's the tagline for Sylvester Stallone film from the 80s. It has to be. He's a surgeon by day and a vigilante by night. Please tell me that exists somewhere.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about, as far as what you were saying, Todd, with like soul murder and stuff, and how, like I think a lot of times when people look at, say, serial killers or quote, evil people, they try to kind of explain away the act itself by like reducing it to like causality, like, oh, they had this childhood, so like they weren't really in control of themselves when they did it, like, and I think from what you're saying, it sounds like that's kind of what the soul murder is, like you're kind of completely negating like the meaning of whatever evil act is.
Right, I am, and also how, and this is where sometimes the conversation stops, is that to tag the one who is the serial killer as the murderer of the soul, and reducing the serial killer as nothing but the murderer of the soul kills the serial killer's soul. And so whenever we sort of, again, negate this person as the evil one, we're doing evil when we're doing that.
Right.
Now, of course, the way the conversation generally goes in that kind of way is that I come across as a sociopath who is a chaplain for the evil or for the devil. And in some ways my answer is yes. And if you mean by that a sympathy for meaning that is even destructive. And I think the way into the evil is about understanding what is the project being lived out no matter what it is. It's not an agreement with or a reinforcement of or an interest in cheering on destruction, but it is an assumption that I do have that even those who are evil for reasons. There's something that is operative in that I don't see resolving itself by just tagging and dismissing folks.
Right. The dismissal part is that's the phenomenology. If you're going to be a phenomenologist, you can't dismiss anything. You have to just keep trying to find the radically subjective experience that we then all share.
Well, when the trade towers came down, I lost people I knew in that. But I did not hear somebody ask, what's going on where somebody is so hatefully destructive that they will drive a plane into a building and kill everybody in it? What's operative with that? Do we not have room to ask that question without the conversation being set down? Is the asking of the question evil? Is not allowing the question to be asked evil? Those are the questions I have.
I hope this doesn't offend people who like Sex and the City, but I believe the second Sex and the City movie is exactly what you're talking about, like asking that question. Well, there's your answer. So
you just cited Sex and the City.
Of course, you got to bring it back to Sex and the City. If you've seen the movie, it's
Jason,
like, oh my God.
You're handing your credentials right now.
Looking at that, the idea of ISIS, it's in the news now, so it's timely. How would you describe the experience? It's on YouTube, it's in the media. From your perspective, what I'm hearing is that that's a closing down of that experience. What was going on in that moment?
Well, for me, again, when I see what ISIS is doing, I recoil in horror and rage and upset, and personally, given what I see operative, it's terribly disturbing. But I'm still trying to ask the fact, if ISIS was in therapy with me, what would I do with that? Would I correct them? Would I tell them be moral? Would I tell them you're bad while the rest of the world is good? And I would hope at least that I'd want to listen to what is in the gun for an ISIS member. What is the ISIS member trying to say about what most ultimately or deeply matters to that person? And I guess it certainly could lend itself to a debate as to whether people have to earn the right to have their meaning heard and considered. I don't think so. I think meaning is meaning. It's
Yeah.
ontological, meaning it's inherent in everything,
Yeah.
including somebody that's a part of ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
I condemn personally what they're doing, but I think it's a condemnation of myself and everyone else who can't understand a hearing about what's being said in relation to what it means to be a human being in this world.
The communication of it.
To the hearing of it, the validation, not agreement, the
Yeah.
respect of the pain.
Right.
That
Right.
pain is inherent in, I think, what destructive acts are about. And I do believe getting at the pain has something to do with being able to offer options for other than destruction to happen.
I remember, I think it was my first year, you were a part of what we called at the time Meeting of the Minds, where we had people from different therapeutic orientations, and you were doing existential phenomenology. And there was a student who asked one of the people from the psychoanalytic orientations, you know, do you believe that you can cure like a sociopath? And he was the reader, the psychoanalytic person was the reader, and I think you were the chair on that person's dissertation, and the psychoanalytic person said, no, I don't believe that. And you were like, well, I believe you can, so you got a long road ahead of you.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in that moment, I was like, okay, I want Todd to be my chair. But
Mm-hmm.
I think I was in your office the next week. But I think what's fascinating is the stamina that you have going into these experiences. I guess, again, the rabbit hole that keeps coming up for me, it's almost like you are a method actor in when you're doing research. Would you say that's
Say more.
like a method actor, meaning
probably,
that
but say more.
you know, where who was the guy who played the Joker the second time?
Oh, yeah,
Heath
Heath
Ledger.
Ledger, yeah.
Mhm.
You know, Jack Nicholson said to Heath Ledger, you know, because he knew he was a method actor, like, you shouldn't do the Joker, like it'll take you down that
Right,
rabbit hole.
right.
And you know, a lot of people say it did.
Right.
You know, and that he really got into the character in a way that he became the Joker, who
Mhm.
isn't then all evil, but.
Well, I think you're also kind of hinting at something that I think is also true, is that if you really do want to be a chaplain for the devil, you have to open yourself up to the meaning of the phenomenon that can be very destructive.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it works on you. I think it can impact you. I think it can infect you. I think it can damage you. But I think it's one of the sacrificial pieces to consider in terms of being able to address, like the Joker.
Yeah.
What's operative with the Joker? Hearing the Joker's story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those kinds of things. I do think it can impact you in that sense. What I'm trying to do is get underneath the abstractions. Joker, sociopath, because we are not abstract categories. People aren't abstractions. We're not diagnoses. We're human beings living in the world. We may be living destructively in the world, but the fact is, if I'm going to actually join the meaning of somebody, even if I'm opposed to what they're doing, I've got to be open to how it matters for them.
It seems to me that the projection, if you're joining in that experience or being open to it, that if there's stigma in, I imagine you presenting in front of an audience and enduring, you know, whatever stigma might be out there that, you know, that is having a reaction, but that is almost a projection of their connection to what it is that you're talking about. That it's almost like it's a jettison because they don't want to become aware, have that awareness, and then have the responsibility.
I think we stigmatize and name when we get anxious and nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way to gain some order or control over experiences that feel bigger than we are and that we can't control. And whether the projections are positive or negative, again, when we reach to name rather than engage, I think we've left the experience that's necessary of trying to get at what we mean by evil.
Kevin, Joe, do you guys have any final thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I was just anticipating kind of the things that we were gonna talk about today, and one of the things that came up for me was, you know, if we don't, I think we've kind of been talking around this, but like if we don't conclusively say that, like, you know, the Nazis are evil and like objectively just say that, then I'm gonna feel judged as evil, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lot of times. I think that's the rabbit hole, and that's how people, because right now I'm just curious about like what keeps people in that process of like, and I think that there's just a tremendous fear about like losing your connection with other people. that if you don't engage in that process, that you're
Shunned or
you're
ostracized.
alienated from it. Which is, I mean, it's paradoxical because I imagine like German citizens back in Hitler probably saying the same thing that I am now. Like if I don't think the Jews are evil, I'm going to be seen as evil and I'm going to be persecuted. So.
And I think that's a fair stance that people have, that either you're for or against.
Yeah.
And if you're not against, you must be for. I think that's an either-oring that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that any kind of destruction, and I have been to Dachau, and I remember walking through the Dachau experience and couldn't speak for several hours after I left the museum there.
Yeah.
Something massive was operative that I can't compare to some other kind of experience. And I would just intermittently start bursting into tears. And I couldn't understand that. And when my family went to D.C. to the Holocaust Museum there, I remember my daughter and I were going up to see the mural when they opened up the mural of all the bodies that were stacked up. And my daughter started crying. And we went back downstairs, and the volunteers who were hosting the experience were Holocaust survivors. And one of the older gentlemen there at the time, we were talking with him, he asked what was going on, and I said, well, she just was upset by what she saw. And he patted her on the head and said, me too. And there's something that, how is my daughter able to have access to that experience, or my reaction at Dachau when I wasn't there? What is lingering in the air that's not any particular person or any particular act, that something catches us up?
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was there. You know, I was starting, and I think it's like we all, it's there. It's about access. Do we allow ourselves access? That the phenomenological experience is just an opening up, maybe like a casting of a wider net, so to speak, instead of closing down. And what to your point, Kevin, it seems like if you're talking about evil in a way that sounds to other people as if you're joining with that act, whatever it is, and you're ostracized, that in itself felt evil to me at the moment. You know, that, like, and I think
that's what I mean. That's exactly what Kevin's talking about.
Yeah.
But again, I think another sort of either-oring that happens is if you're open to understanding and engaging with what lived destruction or lived evil is about, doesn't mean you too can't take your stance opposing the destruction. I think people think you have to do one or the other, and I don't think you do.
Joe, any final thoughts?
I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think you should just start a new podcast where we just get into the minds of supervillains.
Yes.
I'm in.
That's what I would like to see.
You will definitely be on for future podcasts. Okay, well, it's time to wrap up. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Todd DeBose, Joe Slepsky, and Kevin Sprankle. Special thanks to our executive producer, Madison Hurd, our associate producer, sound mixer, and post-production editor, John Branham. And thanks to our audience members who are here today. Of course, thanks to all of our fellow conversationalists and listeners out there. You participate just as much as we do, so we appreciate that. Don't forget, no one understands your insurance benefits and what your insurance plan is all about. Existential Coffee, go and grab one. All right, bye. What's a pirate's favorite holiday?
Arbor Day.
Yeah.
What's their favorite Olympic event?
Archery.
Or the high bar.